dark, dull, dreary winter nights. Well, here is what Jesus says in John 12, verse 46. I have come into the world as light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. Here is light to cheer, to brighten, to bring hope to those in darkness. Well, notice then, this verse clearly implies that the world is in darkness. Notice what Jesus says. He says, I have come into the world as light so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. That means that that's where people are. They are in darkness, and it's only in believing in Jesus that they'll get out of darkness. The world is in darkness. People remain, they stay, they abide there. As Bishop Westcott says, there is darkness over the world, and without him it must remain as being the normal state of man without Christ. It's the darkness, first of all, of ignorance. Sometimes we say, I'm in the dark. I'm in the dark about that. I'm ignorant of that fact, or whatever it is, whatever topic they're talking about. I'm in the dark about it. Well, there is the darkness of ignorance. And at the end of Isaiah chapter 8, before we come into those glorious words in Isaiah 9 that we sang earlier, in Isaiah 8 we read these words, Isaiah 8 verse 19. When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. Then they will look towards the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Here is the darkness of ignorance as a result of rejecting revealed truth. If you reject revealed truth, that doesn't bring enlightenment, that brings darkness. As Paul says in Romans 1, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so don't we see in our society that people are in the dark? They're in the dark about their identity. Who am I? They're in the dark about their purpose. They're in the dark about the meaning of life. They've turned from the law and the testimony, God's revelation, and so they're in the dark. And we see that in our world in broad, bold letters at the moment. People are in the dark. There's the darkness of ignorance. But that leads inevitably to the darkness of immorality. You remember in the Star Wars film, Luke is warned about going to the dark side. That's not the darkness of ignorance, that's the darkness of wrong and evil. There's the darkness of immorality. Hear what Paul says when he writes to the Ephesians in Ephesians 4 and verse 17. He says to these believers in Ephesus, so I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. See, notice how the darkness of ignorance leads to the darkness of immorality. Don't we see that in our society today? Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. And our media is full of such things. People have an appetite for these things. Paul goes on in Ephesians 5 and verse 8. You were once darkness, he says to these Christians. You were once darkness. But now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light. The fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them, for it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. Fruitless deeds of darkness. They're shameful. The world is in the dark. Our society is in the dark. The darkness of immorality has taken grip because people have turned away from the truth and therefore their lives have turned to the dark side. And so there is the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of immorality, and the darkness of despair. But it's a very vivid word, isn't it? Gloom. It's very gloomy. Well, that's a very fitting word to speak of the darkness of despair. The psalmist in Psalm 143 gives an interesting picture of this. Psalm 143 verse 3, the enemy pursues me, he crushes me to the ground, he makes me dwell in darkness like those long dead. So my spirit grows faint within me, my heart within me is dismayed. He's in the darkness, and therefore his spirit grows faint. His heart is dismayed. Here is the darkness of despair, a hopelessness. And materialism will always lead to that. Now, there are two sorts of materialism. There's the materialism of philosophy that says the material world is all there is. There's only the world that you can see and feel and experiment. The physical world, that's all. The material world is all there is. Well, that's going to lead to despair. Because when your material life is over, that's it. You're finished. It's gone. There's nothing else. There's no spirit. There's no soul. There's no eternity. That materialism must lead to despair. And it does. There's the other materialism, commercial materialism, getting things. We speak about that materialism. When you want things, you want more materials, you want stuff. Well, that will lead to despair because material things will never satisfy, will never bring fulfillment, will never totally bring what life was designed for. There's the darkness of despair, and we see that darkness enveloping our society. People despairing. The suicide rate amongst young men is higher than it ever has been. And in other countries, people's despair, hopelessness. And these things have all been exacerbated by the pandemic that we're in, bringing this darkness. But this is the darkness we're in as humanity apart from Christ. We are in darkness because we have turned from the light. John said in his prayer there in the garden, Adam and Eve turned their back on the light and went their own way, and that way was into darkness. So as Isaiah says, you're not going to find light with mediums and spiritists. To the law and to the testimony, God's revealed word, if they do not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. They will look towards the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom. They will be thrust into utter darkness. The world is in darkness. But that passage in Isaiah goes on, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Yes, the world is in darkness. Jesus is light. This is what Jesus says, verse 46 of John 12. I have come into the world as light. You notice that's how I've read it. Those following in the NIV will notice it says, I have come as a light. Actually, the Greek language has no equivalent to our a. It has the, but it doesn't have an a to say of one thing amongst others. So sometimes it's assumed you can apply it, supply it to a sentence. So it could be there, but I think in terms of what Jesus says elsewhere, we can read it as, I have come into the world as light. That's, of course, the theme, one theme that John traces in his gospel. Remember back in chapter 1, he says in verse 4 and 5 of chapter 1, in him, the one who with God created all things, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. The darkness can't get to grips with it. It goes on in verse 9 of that chapter, the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. In chapter 3 of John's Gospel, in verse 19, this is the verdict, light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil, but light has come into the world. Chapter 8 and verse 12, after the woman who was taken in adultery, Jesus spoke again to the people. He said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, never, but will have the light of life. When Jesus comes to heal that man who was born blind in John chapter 9 and verse 5, he says in chapter 9 and verse 5, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus is light. And picking up those areas of darkness, he brings the light of revelation. Notice what he says back in the previous verse, verse 45 of John 12. When he looks at me, he sees the one who sent me. So when a man believes in me, he does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. When he looks at me, he sees the one who sent me. Jesus reveals God. God has revealed himself in creation. That's what Paul was saying in Romans 1. People have turned they've suppressed the truth of God revealed in the created order. But Jesus reveals God fully and magnificently and clearly, so that when you see Jesus, you see God. Jesus reveals the truth about God. But also Jesus reveals the truth about man. You notice how earlier he was spoken of as the Son of Man. Jesus shows us what man was meant to be, what humans are meant to be, as he lived in total obedience to God, serving his Father in all that he said and all that he did. That's what humans were designed for. Jesus fulfilled humanity's design as he lived on earth, the perfect human life. And so that's revealed to us in Jesus, what human life is about. He reveals God to us. He reveals what human life is to us. Jesus is light to those in darkness. He brings the light of redemption from immorality, from the guilt and grip of immorality. And there is a darkness about the guilt that immorality brings to people's minds and hearts. But Jesus brings light into that darkness and deliverance from that guilt and from the grip of immorality as he brings new life. How does Jesus do that? Well, what did he say earlier in this passage? Verse 31, now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, the one who tempts us to immorality. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. It was through his death that Jesus brings light into the darkness of immorality by redeeming us from darkness, by delivering us from the guilt and grip of sin that has so encased our lives and left us in the gloom. The light of redemption. Jesus brings the light of hope, as he speaks of himself in the previous chapter as, I am the resurrection and the life. He assures us that there is more beyond this earth. He is the resurrection who will raise our mortal bodies and transform them to be like his glorified body. He grants us the hope of eternal life. He goes on to say, doesn't he, in verse 50, I know that his command, the Father's command, leads to eternal life. Jesus has brought life and immortality to light through the gospel that we read in the pastoral epistles. He's brought life and immortality to light. See, Jesus came into the world as light. And so he went into the darkness of our human society, this world. And when John uses the world, it's almost always with a negative connotation. The world in its rebellion against God, the world in its rejection of God, the world that's under the power of the prince of this world. Jesus came into that darkness. And then he took all our immorality and bore it to his body on the tree, and for 3 hours was sunk in deepest darkness. Remember, the sun stopped shining. There was darkness over the land for 3 hours as Jesus entered the darkness, the gloom, the despair. You know, that despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is there any more cry of desperate despair than that? Jesus entered the darkness and conquered it in grace and glory by his dying, the sinless one for our sin. He conquered the darkness. And so the darkness cannot overcome the light that has shone. He entered the darkness in his life and death, conquered it in his resurrection glory. The world is in darkness. Jesus is light. And then notice, believing in Jesus delivers from darkness. I have come into the world as light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. How do we get from darkness to light? By believing in Jesus. Earlier in the passage, it said the same thing back in verse 36 of John 12. Jesus says in verse 35, you are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. The man who walks in the dark does not know where he is going. Put your trust in the light while you have it, so that you may become sons of light. It was wonderful to visit Claire on Friday down in Overton. And almost the first thing she said as we sat down, isn't it amazing? All we have to do is believe. All we have to do is believe. And God blesses us beyond imagination, just as we believe, as we trust in Jesus. See, don't look within for inner light. That's what the Quakers do, isn't it? You look for inner light. Look within. And our society would recommend that. Our culture, look within for the light within. No. That's darkness. Don't look within. And don't look around to other humans for light. They might have some light because of God's common grace, but it's candlelight compared to the Sun of Righteousness. Don't look within, don't look around, look to Christ, who is light in all its fullness and all that we need for deliverance from darkness. Lord, literally here in John 12:46, Jesus says, the one believing into me should not stay in darkness. The one believing, it's a present continuous, not something you do once, it's something you do continuously. Trusting Jesus every day, trusting through the narrow way. Even when my faith is small, trusting Jesus. That is all. And it's the one believing into me. John has this very unusual phrase that he reports of Jesus speaking and in his own terminology. Normally we speak about believing in someone, but John in his gospel speaks of believing into Jesus. I think the idea is it's speaking of a transfer of trust. You take it from one thing and put it into another. It's a total transfer of your trust. Whatever it is you're trusting, yourself. Well, take that trust and put it into Jesus. Take it out of yourself and put it into Jesus. For trusting in your upbringing and ceremonies and rituals you've been through. Take your trust out of that and put it into Jesus. The complete transfer of our reliance, our confidence, our trust from whatever else it might be into Jesus, the light. The world is in darkness. And apart from Christ, we are in darkness. The darkness of ignorance, the darkness of immorality, the darkness of despair. Jesus is light. Believing in Jesus, simply trusting in him, delivers from darkness now and forever. Glory to his name. We're going to conclude by singing, Lord, the light of your love is shining. Lord, shine on me. We're going to be very frustrated in the hall that we can't sing this out loud. I'll be tempted to go outside and sing it, but it's raining, so